Hello, students. My name is Noé Juarez, and as we met last week, I will be one of your co-professors at the class The Church and Social Change. And this is my first lecture that will cover the topic of church and social change. This is an introduction lecture about this topic, and I'll be sharing as I speak some of the PowerPoint presentation in the video, but also I'll be posting in a PDF document the whole PowerPoint. You can watch the video and follow my talk here, and you can also download or read on the PDF document. So the introduction for church and social change, I want to begin with one Bible verse. I like starting my lectures reading one Bible verse, one chapter, something from the Bible. And this one's from the book of Psalm chapter 9 verse 9. Psalm chapter 9 verse 9. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. I just want to emphasize the word oppressed here. The translation here says the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, but other translations can also say the Lord is a refuge for the poor. In fact, in Spanish, that's the translation they use. This comes from the Hebrew word ladak, and it's so interesting how oppression and poverty are connected to the same root in Hebrew. So people who are oppressed, who suffer oppression, are also connected to poverty. So those who live in poverty might be facing oppression, and those who are facing oppression may be in poverty. So this is something that I would like to share here, so we can discuss some more in our classes, in our lectures. Oppression and poverty from the same root word in Hebrew, which is ladak. Okay, so it's something to think about as we begin our class today. So our lecture begins defining these two words. Our class is the church and social change, and I think it's important to begin our lecture and our class by defining the church and defining social change. So in this class, we are defining church as the ecclesia. As you know, in Greek, the word church is ecclesia, and the translation of ecclesia is public assembly. It's also this idea of public witness. So the first Christians got into the marketplaces, public places, and that's where they spoke about their faith, right? So even when they gather in their houses, they witnessed with their neighbors and people around them. So it's not this church in the original sense. It's not this building a group who go into a special private worship service where only a group of people have access to or welcome to, but it's a public assembly. That's what the word ecclesia means. So in this class, when we talk about the church, we'll be talking about the church being a public witness, the church being in the community, and the church being in the public assembly. What does it mean for us to be church in public, in the marketplace, downtown, in the neighborhoods, communities, and so forth? Well, the next word that we have to define is social change, right? I remember when we started teaching this class a few years ago, one of the students raised a hand and said, Professor, Jesus never talked about social change. And I started thinking about it. Oh, Jesus never used perhaps the word social change in the way that we may be using it, but he a catalyst. He started movements. He started ideas and new teachings that actually caused a lot of social change in the first century. So social change, the way I would define is it's a movement of people. that causes a transformation, right? Social change, it's uses a lot of it's a process where groups of people, communities, in a few months or in a few years or in a few generations can transform, can change, right? Can make a difference in the community. So that's what we will be talking about in this class. When we say church and social change, we're talking about how church leaders and how you students can be part of the movements. Some of the examples of the movements are the first Christians who changed the social Jewish and Gentile structures. The nonviolent resistance in India, how changed the history of India. And of course, we'll be reading a book by the autobiography of Martin Luther King, and we'll be talking about the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. We'll be watching some parts of the movie Cesar Chavez later, where we'll see how in the Hispanic population in California, they were part of some social change movements. You can think of some other examples in our class, right? So, church and social change. I want to give you a few themes about what the church and social change looks in the Old Testament, in the Bible, right? And I want to pause here to discuss something that it's very important to start thinking about when we talk about social change, which is the prophetic versus priestly role of leaders. So some of you are going to be pastors, some of you are going to be community leaders. I think what is helpful to me is to kind of distinguish between the prophetic role and the priestly role. What I mean by this is that the prophetic role is when you speak truth, when you tell what it is to people in power, or tell in prayer and in conviction to speak up and to do something that you think is not right. So that's the prophetic role. The priestly role is all the things that we do in church in the pastoral ministry, like leading worship, preaching a sermon, leading communion, doing baptisms, weddings, funerals, pastoral counseling. All of these are very important roles for a pastor or minister. But in this class, we're going to be sharing some ways how a pastor can be both prophet and priest, a prophet and a pastor. When God calls you to be a pastor, or when God is calling you to be a prophet. One can be both, or one can be one. So there's some things to think about. So in the Bible, we see some themes of church and social change, right? Theology and social change. A few examples of social change could be in the Old Testament. We see Yahweh always saying that He is the God of liberation. In the book of Exodus, we see how God is causing a social movement. A group of people in Egypt are being liberated by God, and they're leaving Egypt, the slavery in Egypt. They go into the wilderness, and from there they go to the promised land. That's a social movement, the way we're looking at here in the class. When they are in the promised land, there are prophets who speak, and they are fulfilling also social changes. They are questioning when kings are not doing the right thing. Prophets come and speak truth. That's part of social change. When the Israelites are in exile, people like Ezekiel, Isaiah, and prophets, they speak up for change. They gave a sense of identity of who these people are. And in exile, they learn how to create a social change. There are so many Bible verses that talk about justice for orphans, justice for widows, for foreigners, loving your neighbor. Isaiah 58:6-10 would be one example of how fasting has to go alongside of practicing justice. So that's being an example. There's a lot of Bible verses that talk about freeing the oppressed, feeding the hungry, and that how the wounds will be healed. There's another metaphor that I would like to introduce here in this class about church and social change, which is the metaphor of Ezekiel chapter 33. In this chapter, ministers are called to be the watchman and the watchwoman of their times. Here, this is a beautiful metaphor. At that time, as you know, people, they were watchmen who were in high towers, and they will stand there, and if their enemy were coming, they will announce the people so they could close all the walls of the city to protect the people. And I think that's one of the roles of people, church leaders like yourself, when it comes to being part of the church and social change. God calls us to be visionary prophets, right? Watchmen and watchwomen for justice, for change. Just let's think about that. And of course, we all know Amos chapter 5, when it talks about let justice roll on like river, right? We all know that beautiful verse. Micah 6:8, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Hosea 12:6, repent, act with love and justice. Some brief themes of social change in the New Testament. So we're going throughout the whole Bible, just in a brief way. In the New Testament, see in the Gospels the holistic approach of Jesus in his ministry. Matthew 4:23 describes how Jesus was preaching, teaching, and healing in all the towns. And I think in this class, I want to emphasize the word healing. The word healing in Greek, or as you might know, it's therapuo. The word therapy comes from therapuo. And this is not only about physical healing with medicine, but it's also about community healing. So Jesus is not only healing the sick woman or the people who are struggling with leprosy, but Jesus is actually healing the communities. He's restoring relationships. They were like the Samaritan woman, or like the 10 lepers. They were people who were left out. They were outside of the community, and by healing them, therapuo, Jesus is restoring the community and the relationship. So in this class, we want to share the point that Jesus is calling us, we the church, to be part of that community healing, to bring change and restoration in the downtown neighborhoods, in the suburban areas or rural areas, wherever God calls us to serve. We are being part of the healing, the therapy of community, and wherever God calls us. And of course, the first sermon of Jesus, imagine that, when Jesus is called to preach, one of the first sermons, he says, I was called to set the oppressed free. Remember when I said that in Hebrew, the word oppressed is connected to poor. So Jesus was called to free the poor, to set the oppressed free. Very interesting way to think about it. We all know about Matthew 25. Matthew 25 is this beautiful parable about the sheep and the goat, right? And this is a parable about how Jesus is going to say that when whoever was hungry or naked or in prison, they were Jesus himself. And that whoever has fed the hungry, who has given them shelter, or visited in prison, or welcome them, the stranger. That's Jesus himself being in our place. So in this class of church and social change, I want to make a point that part of our purpose to be in the community and to be in the social change is to serve Jesus in the faces of the poor, the oppressed, and the people in need. We'll be talking some other lectures about the Good Samaritan, another important parable. I also want to just introduce very briefly about Romans chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 13. This is, they're both 13. So Romans chapter 13 talks about how we should submit or obey the authorities. But then Revelation chapter 13 talks about how people in power can be like the beast, kind of acting, oppressing people. So we have to put in the balance between obeying the authorities and also seeing that sometimes people in power can have some behaviors that can be so oppressive, kind of like a beastly behavior in Revelation 13. So very interesting way to think about how to speak truth into power. Now I want to transition a little bit about something that for your first assignment, we are assigning you to write a paper about the 4 roles of social change by Bill Moyer. And I'll be posting an article about this, but I want to describe very briefly about this for you. There are at least 4 roles that has been described by sociologist Bill Moyer a few decades ago. And this social role, this 4 roles of social change are: number 1, helpers, advocates, organizers, and rebel radicals. Let's describe very briefly, and again, you can read the article more extensively, and we can discuss together in our next Zoom class about this. So in social change, there are some people who are called to be helpers. Helpers are those are professionals, counselors, people who are involved in charity work and service, people who may be involved in local and global mission. So serving in a church, I may be fulfilling the role of a helper. I'm helping people. The role of the advocate are people like lawyers or people who are trained or informed, who speak on behalf of somebody else. So they're advocating for somebody else. So they might go to Washington, D.C. and advocate on behalf of women's rights or LGBT or any people whose rights might not be heard. You can advocate. Advocates can write letters, can do petitions, can lobby, and so many things. The third social change model is an organizer. I think this is, we can think when we talk about community organizing, right? Like Martin Luther King, we'll be reading some more about his life, like Cesar Chavez. Recently, when we saw about the marches last summer on Black Lives Matter, there were people who were organizing peaceful protests in the cities. Just recently, just last week, in Peru, the Congress impeached the president just because they wanted to do that. And a lot of young people went to the streets and they started protesting, hundreds, thousands in every city. And because of that organizing, because of those protests, the president who was put by the Congress after the other president was impeached, he had to resign. And now they elected somebody else as an interim president. So there is power in organizing, in going into the streets and making phone calls and doing protests, right? And the last one is the rebel or radical. Radical, I have to admit that this is probably the hardest one for me. Like I feel comfortable being a helper, an advocate, even an organizer. But to be a radical, to be a rebel, is to go to the root causes of social problems, to shake things up, to boycott, to do radical things, or to speak radical things. I invite you to read the article that will be posted in this for this week's class that describes some more about this. So the question that I would like you to think about, and you can pause the video if you like and think about this, is which of these roles fit best with your calling? Do you feel like you're a helper, you're an advocate, you're an organizer, or you are a radical? Or perhaps in your journey you have been some of this in some part of your life. So which of these roles fit best with your calling? I know this lecture is it's a lot of stuff. We're going to go a little bit about talking about this book that we assigned you to read, Ethnography as a Pastoral Practice, by Mary Clark Moschella. Right, so I hope you've been enjoying reading this, but I want to go over a few things about this book, and at the end of this class I'll submit something for you to discuss. I'll leave some questions for you to think about. So what is ethnography? I know that in theology or in the classes that we're studying, we are not being trained professionally to be ethnographers or sociologists, right? Ethnography is, ethno comes from the word nation, or group, culture, and grapho from writing and observing. So ethnography is observing a group of people or observing a culture. So it's as Moschella defines, it's a form of social research used by sociologists and anthropologists to observe and to study living human beings in the social context. Right? Observing. And the reason that we are reading this book is that part of being leaders, church leaders in social change, is that we have to have some tools to understand a culture, a community. A church community is a culture, or a subculture. A city, it's a subculture. A neighborhood is a subculture. A generation is a subculture. The whole idea of talking about ethnography is that as you read this book, that you can have some tools, some skills about how to read, what are the things that you have to pay attention to when it comes to ethnography. So like something an ethnographical research would be that why is it that in America right now there are some people who are so passionate, the evangelicals who are so passionate about their agendas in America, and there are others, the more liberal people, who are in the opposite. Ethnography comes and I ask the question, why are these people so passionate about their agendas or their points of view as an evangelical conservative or liberal Christian? Why did we get here? So ethnography can help us understand that, or at least to begin to understand. So after we talk about ethnography, then we have to talk about theological ethnography. Moschella talks that theological ethnography is a way of immersing yourself in the life of the people to learn, opening your eyes and ears to understand ways in which people live in order to seek transformation. So, theological ethnography. There's an example about the story of Ken. Ken was an African American pastor who practiced theological ethnography to seek transformation in his church. I thought that was an interesting metaphor. Some more. There's Mr. Bronislaw Malinowski was one of the first ethnographers. He was born in 1884 to 1942, and he observed the Aboriginal people in Australia and New Guinea, and he is the author of the participatory observation. So he went and observed how people lived there. There's also Franz Boas. He studied natives in Canada, and he was one of the first who questioned scientific racism, right? So just to finish up this lecture, we covered a lot about church and social change, Bible, Old Testament, New Testament themes of social change, and then we talked about ethnography as an introduction. So here are some questions that I would like to leave with you. What are your initial thoughts about church and social change? Some initial thought about your reading and the lecture that I'm presenting, and also from Kevin Ressel's lecture. What theological framework do you bring to this class? It's important to have some framework. What I mean by framework is that where is your ground? What's your understanding? Like, are you bringing an incarnational theology? Are you bringing a Wesleyan theology? Are you bringing a Barthian, the Karl Barth theology? What are your grounds? What is your understanding of theology? And from there, you will build with this new learnings of social change. And how would you define theological ethnography on your own words, based on the readings and based on the things I just mentioned? And the last question is, what are your thoughts on the first readings of Mochela? So all the chapters that we have asked you to read for now, what are your initial thoughts about that? You can write that on your reflection paper, or you can jot down some of these ideas, and then in our next Zoom meeting, we can, after Thanksgiving, we can discuss together about some of these questions. Well, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in our next lecture, and happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.